On this episode of Newt's World, how are progressive politics eroding core Navy values and their readiness to defend our nation? 17 former military officers applied their insights shaped by combat, command, and senior leadership experience to illuminate the divisive threat of woke politics in the new book, Don't Give Up the Ship. They argue that the impact of politicizing America's military endangers security, erodes readiness, and risks wartime defeat. Here to discuss the new book, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Captain Tom Burbage. He's a former Executive Vice President of Lockheed Martin Aeronautics Company, former General Manager of the F-35 Lightning II program integration, a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He's also one of the founders of the Calvert Task Group. Tom, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate you having us on.
You've had remarkable experience in your life. Can you kind of walk us through from the Naval Academy to today?
Yes, sir. I grew up in a family of naval aviators. My father was a career naval aviator, and most of my role models as a young guy were naval aviators, and it seemed natural that's the path I wanted to follow. So I applied and got accepted to the Naval Academy. Graduated from there in 1969, and my first squadron was with the E-2 Hawkeye, which is a radar plane, flies off of carriers, and basically is the air traffic controller for the airplanes that are in the air wing. Then got the tremendous opportunity to go to the Navy Test Pilot School. I was the first E-2 guy to actually go there, and graduated from there, was a test pilot for a number of years at Patuxent River. And then I went out to the USS Eisenhower, and I was the catapult and arresting gear officer on a nuclear carrier that was going on its maiden deployment. Today, that carrier is considered one of the older ones in the fleet, but at the time, it was brand new. I left active duty in 1980 and went to work for Lockheed before they were Lockheed Martin out in California, in Burbank, and went out to fly with them as a test pilot, but it turned out they weren't testing anything new, so I got into their program management, business development operation, and sort of went from there. I spent 2 years in Washington, spent 10 years in the Marietta facility, at the time was part of your jurisdiction, and I recall vividly you coming out to the plant and being the guest speaker, primary speaker at the rollout ceremony of the F-22 Raptor airplane in Marietta. Following that, I was the president of that company for just a short period of time while they were consolidating companies, and then I went to Fort Worth to run the F-35 program. I've been retired now for 10 years. Thought I would be on the golf course enjoying the retired life and chasing grandkids and all those things that we do when we get to this stage of our life. But myself and a number of my classmates felt the urge to come off the couch and try to be a voice in the future of the country, which we think is under threat in a number of areas today.
I have to say, by the way, because of my background representing Marietta, you were involved with the C-130J. I guess the C-130 may be the most successful airframe ever designed. The C-5, the F-22, these were all built in my district. And the F-22 is still a remarkable air dominance fighter. My guess is it still has no peer in the world.
I believe that. Yes, sir.
This is a slight detour, but I can't help myself. Could you just walk us through the net advantage of the F-35 with all of its technology and its interoperability with each other? It's really very different than any previous airplane, and I would be honest and tell you I don't understand it.
It is a different concept. The U.S. and our allies fly very similar aircraft. Most of our closest allies fly U.S. frontline fighters. All of their fleets are aging, some more rapidly than ours, and the United States government and the military came to the conclusion that we're not going to fight any future wars alone, that we'll be flying and fighting together as a coalition of operators. And so they invited the closest allies, 8 other countries, to join us in the development of the next generation aircraft. And if you just think of the F-22 and the F-35, they're actually 10 years apart in terms of technology and design freeze. And the missions are quite different. F-22 air combat, King Kong in the air, F-35 more a strategic, fly in multiple airplanes in the same formation, very stealthy, hard to detect, able to attack heavily defended strategic targets. So the different missions drove the airplanes to different kinds of designs.
You've really flown in something like 38 different kinds of aircraft, which is pretty remarkable. How do you react to the notion that one of the next phases may be using very advanced drones and fleets around a plane, so that the plane will be coordinating a whole series of sort of satellite aircraft?
I think that's the next step. There's always the argument of whether we'll ever leave manned aircraft. I personally think we never will, because the human mind, the human brain is important in any combat scenario where human life becomes a major criteria. I think you'll see airplanes. I think it's happening now in the experimental areas where an airplane like an F-35 will be controlling unmanned aircraft on its wing, be able to send that unmanned aircraft into a threat area to set off the enemy's systems, or however they want to use it strategically to, again, attack an ever more heavily defended target.
The race for survival is not going to slow down, it seems to me. But that's precisely what leads us to what makes it interesting about what you've done. Because you and a group of fellow Naval Academy graduates created the Calvert Task Group. What led to that, and why did you pick that title?
Well, as I said, most of us are Naval Academy graduates, not all of us. Most of us are from an age when patriotism and love of country were primary in our lives, and we've seen some erosion of that in the lives of today's youth. We were playing golf on occasions and having difficulty remembering everybody's email address, so we put ourselves under a blank email that we called the Calvert Group. And that's really how it started. It was a social club more than anything else. It's named after Admiral James Calvert, who was the superintendent at the Academy when most of us were there, and a very famous naval leader of first submarine, the USS Nautilus, to surface at the North Pole, and had a very distinguished Navy career. We contacted his family, and once we kind of came off the couch, we contacted his family to see if they had any concerns about us actually continuing to use the name as we moved into a more public view, and they didn't. They were glad that he was remembered the way we remembered him. But we came off the couch and we decided to get engaged, and it started with an incident at the Naval Academy, which is most of our alma maters, and it was very concerning to us. It was about 2019. It was when the very early stages of COVID were starting. It was when the Black Lives Matter and the Summer of Love, quote unquote, peaceful demonstrations were starting to occur. And there was a very much of a fracture between police generation and the rioters. And one of the midshipmen at the Naval Academy had parents were both Los Angeles Police Department policeman and policewoman. And he was caught up in an internal squabble over whether he should be commissioned or not based on him taking some anonymous positions that were in favor of the police. So long story short, that got us engaged in the Naval Academy. We were concerned with some things we saw. We went to the Naval Academy, met with the current superintendent, asked him a bunch of questions, didn't get a lot of good answers. And that sort of grew to a bigger concern that most of that level in the service were being heavily influenced by policy. Policies that many of us were unaware of, or at least hadn't woken up to because we'd been kind of out of the mainstream. I think the same thing could be said of the school systems, the K through 12 school systems, where most of the parents weren't really aware of what was being taught in schools until children were forced to stay home and parents were able to look over their shoulder and see what they were being taught. And it generated, a reaction among parents, and it generated a reaction among us that we've lost something in the society today in the way that things are being done from a policy standpoint. So we elevated our scope a little bit from the Naval Academy to the Navy and defense in general. There's so many areas that could be challenged today, and you can't boil the ocean. So we tried to stay limited in the way that we were focused. But that led to the Calvert Task Group. It's sort of a play on words. We were just a Calvert Group, but then Calvert Task Group sounds a little bit more like the Navy. So we wanted to be a force for good, although we were viewed certainly in the early days and somewhat today as an outside group that was contradicting or countering the policies that were in place, and that's exactly what we were.
Why should the average citizen be worried about the kind of changes? I understand culturally, us older guys may wonder about the next generation. I think that's been true forever. But from a national security, national survival standpoint, why should Americans be worried about the evolution of the Defense Department in general and the Navy in particular?
I look at it as there's a number of pillars that are fundamental to a constitutional republic. And the more I hear the word democracy is at threat, the more it makes you feel that people don't really understand what a democracy is and what a constitutional republic is. But a constitution starts with the oath. It has some fundamental pillars, free and fair elections, various things, and then finally a strong national defense, peace through strength. And when you see that divisive ideology taking place in the training that leads up to becoming a leader in the military, inside the military, you would expect to see a natural regression in both recruiting and retention. And for an all-volunteer force like we have today, recruiting and retention is fundamental to maintaining that force. In the end, the ultimate metric is readiness. And if you read the news today, you can see lots of examples where readiness is not at its best right now. In fact, I just read an article last week that 17 Navy support ships were being tied up because they don't have the crews to man them. So the three things sort of run together: recruiting, retention, and readiness. And they're not doing so well right now.
Do you think part of that is a rejection of the emerging culture of the military, that it's not attracting the kind of people that used to think they wanted to be in the military?
Yes, sir. I think that's a big part of it. I think the heart and soul of the military recruiting population in the past has been sort of middle America, center-right, military background in the family, Christian background. Those things have all sort of withered under this DEI ideology, which pits aggressors against the aggressed. I think from a recruiting standpoint, the candidate pool has become a lot weaker. And when it becomes a lot weaker, then standards get lowered, and that has an ultimate secondary effect on the military. When you look at retention, I think most of the folks that are in the military want to be in the military for a reason, and that's to defend the country and be involved in keeping the country where it needs to be on the world stage. And I think that requires a certain amount of bandwidth to stay focused on that mission. And then when that bandwidth gets used up by ideology training, things that are not fundamental to unity in the military, I think there's a natural repelling of that for those that are spending their time in the military. So again, results on retention challenges.
Somebody told me the other day that the problem of retention is as great as the problem of recruitment.
I've heard that, and I've heard that on retention, you can be incentivized to be retained through financial benefits. And in recruiting, you can expand your recruiting population by lowering standards, whether they're academic, whether they're physical, wherever they are. And if you look at the societal changes that have happened in the last 10 to 15 years, fatherless homes, lack of role models in the family, in the general population that comes in through the enlisted ranks, it's almost like a Rubik's Cube. You know, there's so many different dimensions of this problem, so many different colors on the cube. It's hard to figure out how do you get all these things back in sync.
So what led you as a group to decide to write a book?
Well, that's another interesting point. We're all kind of closet essayists, and we would spend time at home at night, you know, writing, putting your thoughts on paper, saying, why in the world is this happening? Why aren't more people speaking out? Why isn't this a bigger issue? And we had a fairly large number of articles published in various newspapers and magazines and things like that. But a published article has a shelf life of about 48 hours, and then people move on to the next subject. So we thought we would put these into a book, and maybe the book would open up a new avenue, and it has. It's opened up the podcast genre, and it allows us to talk to people like you and others and try to get our message out through a broader audience. Our whole objective has been to try to just be a voice, try to reason with folks, try to make people understand that policies are much more important than personalities when you're making a big decision that could affect the course of the country. And so the podcast genre, and certainly speaking to you, you're at the top of our list for great people to speak to, and that's opened up that world for us. So we're now seeing a much, I think, broader recognition of the issues that we're talking about, and that's all we want to do is get the issues out there.
Let me go to the basics. Where does the term "don't give up the ship" come from?
It's a famous naval saying, and if you walk into Memorial Hall in the Naval Academy, there's a huge blue flag that says, "Don't give up the ship." It started with a Navy officer, a Navy ship that was in combat, the USS Chesapeake, and it was a saying that the captain of the ship would yell over his bullhorn, "Don't give up the ship." It was later memorialized by Oliver Hazard Perry when he came back into another fight in the same conflict, and it became kind of a rallying cry for the Navy and for the Naval Academy. We use it as an analogy. We think to a sailor, the ship is home, the ship is his world, you're at sea. If the ship goes down, you go down. And the ship, from an analogous perspective to us, is America. And if we don't worry about the holes in the hull or the battles that we're in, and that ship goes down, we pretty much go down with it as a nation and the things that we represent.
Some of the stuff that you all have brought to light, that all male units, in terms of ground combat, all male units outperform co-ed units in 70% of combat tasks, and the recommendation to retain all male units because of combat effectiveness was just overruled. Doesn't that mean we're actually setting up people to get killed?
If you trace back the history of the introduction of this socialist-tending ideology into our government institutions, it's not an overnight sensation. It started back in the 2010, 2011 timeframe when ideologies were embedded in a number of the institutions, including the service academies. And it was more or less a fringe, not necessarily dominant way of thinking at the time. And it's expanded dramatically over the last 10 years, and for a number of reasons, in my opinion, one of which is it's become very heavily incentivized financially. The DEI industry, diversity, equity, inclusion industry today is about a $15.5 billion industry. And when you have that kind of money promoting the business of selling that ideology, whether it's to corporations or whether it's to the military, it's hard to deflect that. It gets a life of its own. In the military, it's divisive. It's divisive along racial lines. It's divisive along almost any line you can think of. And when you're in a unit, particularly a combat unit, where life and death is the risk factor, you're not worried about whether your cup of coffee at Starbucks is the right color or not. You're worried about whether your unit is going to survive. You can't tolerate division amongst the troops. You need to have unity. And that ideology is based on the opposite. So that was a major concern. I think anybody that understands combat understands that the female and the male bodies are different biologically. And there's been a number of directions to insert women into the Rangers or insert women into SEALs. And you can't do that effectively when the risk is at a life and death level and when it's very much dependent on physical strength. So there are plenty of roles for every race and gender in the military. Combat is its own special thing, and basically it's because of the risk of life and death that's at stake. You want to have the best. Jim Webb was a senator from Virginia, a Naval Academy graduate, former Secretary of the Navy, had an interesting comment one time when we were still living with the draft. He said, your leaders in combat are highly trained individuals, but the people that actually fight the war are civilians. So when your children and your grandchildren go into a military situation, you want the best leader they can have because it's a life and death situation for them in some scenarios.
And if you're talking about ships in combat, it seems to me that you have moments when you've got to be able to repair, for example, if you get hit by a missile or hit by a round or you hit a mine, you've got to have people capable of doing the work.
You do. If you put technology between the individual and the combat, it's a whole different scenario too. For example, flying an airplane, flying an F-35, flying an F-22, there's no significant difference between the male and the female capability to do that when you're operating a system. It's when you get into the real hand-to-hand or person-to-person type combat scenarios that it makes such a big difference.
Are you seeing any changes in attitudes, or under what circumstance can we get back to a defense-focused military?
That is the question, but that is a tough question. What's the path to recovery? I think it's policy-based. In the military, your incentives are promotion. In the civilian world, your incentives are financial normally. And in the military, since most military people retire at a relatively early age, there's a financial incentive beyond that to get promoted to your top rank. So when you look at incentives, and a lot of this is based on how things are incentivized, they're not incentivized to put things back on the right track. How do you change that? And it gets down to understanding what a constitutional republic is, in my mind, understanding that a strong defense is one of the fundamental pillars of that, and then a policy that allows the senior military leaders to be aggressive and manage that route back to success. One of the most disappointing things that we've had is the number of flag and general officers that are willing to speak out. There are some, but I often wonder why there aren't more. And part of that is because it's not incentivized in the promotion criteria that go into, achieving more senior ranks. I think that's a good part of it.
It seems to me that beginning with Obama, there was a certain amount of political shift in the Pentagon that was pretty aggressive. And you can see the impact in terms of who's gotten promoted and what they're willing to do, and the degree to which they sort of use ideological language to replace reality. If we can win the diversity award while we're getting annihilated, at least we'll have the diversity award.
I think taken to the extreme, that's exactly the question that's in a lot of our minds. The establishment of diversity offices in some of the institutions has been interesting to watch too. And there's another factor underneath all this, which is that words matter. Words like diversity and equity and inclusion. Nobody can argue with diversity being a good thing. Nobody can argue with inclusion being a good thing. Equity, where equal outcomes are assured as opposed to equal opportunities, is another story. And I think the words often disguise the agenda. And should you attack an agenda with a certain set of words, it's not uncommon to see the words change, but the agenda stay.
Well, I noticed that you all came up with 3 alternative words: merit, excellence, and intelligence.
Actually, that came from Alexander Wang, who is the CEO of a tech startup related to artificial intelligence, very smart guy. He said, we're not going to do DEI, we're going to do MEI. And we've always felt that if you really understand the words, the MEI is merit, excellence, and intelligence, I think were the 3 words. If you really understand what those 3 words mean, they mean something that almost pushes you to be excellent, as opposed to allowing folks to have outcomes that are not based on getting the best person into the best job. And I think he's carried that out. One other quick comment on the industry side. There have been 25 major corporations now that have backed off of the DEI. Part of that was written into the regulatory agencies that, inspect annual reports from industry and things like that. And it was almost like the military. There was a certain set of criteria companies were supposed to meet. Sometimes it was called a different 3-letter acronym, but it was the same thing. But companies are backing away from it. And the reason is their shareholders don't see value in it. It doesn't add value to the bottom line, and it consumes resources. Well, there's no reason why that same thing doesn't apply to the military.
I think the combination of things like the Afghanistan withdrawal, the failure to win after 22 years of war, all of that, plus this emphasis on social goals that are non-military, trust and confidence in the American military has dropped from 70% in 2018 to just 46% last year. And that's a 24% drop. And it's no wonder, if that's what's happening, that you have a harder time with recruitment and retention.
Exactly. And I think what kids that are taught coming up through the public school system, particularly, private schools are a little bit different, but the public school system, when's the last time you heard an elementary school class do the Pledge of Allegiance? Or when's the last time you saw an American flag in a classroom? There's other flags in the classroom, but there's not American flags, at least not very often. Young kids are not imbued with the patriotic flavor that most of us had in our generation.
I was struck, though, while the Army and the Navy and the Air Force are having a challenge meeting their recruiting goals, the Space Corps and the Marine Corps are not. I kind of understand the Space Corps because it's small and it has the adventure of going into space. But in your own mind, since the Marines are a part of the Navy and a lot of Marine officers came through Annapolis, Why do you think the Marines are having more success at recruitment than the bigger services?
I think the Marines, and I know a lot of them, and there are a lot of them in our program, F-35 program, and others that I got to work with, had the privilege of working with. I think they have retained the warrior spirit. They've managed to somehow keep that culture of the Marine Corps, and I think people are attracted to join something that's a genuine team. And it's really the team aspect that's unique about the Marine Corps, or in some cases, the special elite groups like the SEALs or people like that. The band of brothers kind of concept. And they've been able to retain that, and I think their pride in the country, their pride in their uniform, the pride in what they do as a mission attracts people. There's still great people out there that want to come in. It's just getting the numbers that you need to man the force that's such a challenge right now.
I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book with the Calvert Task Group is Don't Give Up the Ship. Woke Politics Are Endangering Our Military and Our Nation. It's an interesting read and available now on Amazon. Our listeners can learn more about the Calvert Task Group at calverttaskgroup.org. And I really appreciate, Tom, you taking the time to share with us.
Yes, sir. Well, I appreciate you having us on, and it's great to see you again, and wish you all the best, and hopefully we'll come through with change in direction on the course the nation's on.
Thank you to my guest, Captain Tom Burbage. You can get a link to buy his new book, Don't Give Up the Ship, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Pendley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.